In December 1939, British infantry units of the Expeditionary Force deployed along the Franco-German border in the Saar sector. They dug into existing French positions, taking on the heavy burden of a winter deployment. This period became known as the Phony War. The front was fully occupied, but the guns were mostly silent. There were no major enemy engagements, no sweeping infantry charges, and no heavy artillery barrages shattering the lines. The official military doctrine of the time treated these trenches as temporary holding points. The troops were ordered to maintain strict discipline, continuously improve the earthworks, and remain in a state of constant readiness to move. But the lack of enemy fire masked an active threat. Without a single major battle, the environment itself was quietly breaking the troops down through a relentless accumulation of cold, standing water, and forced fatigue. We have a precise record of how this attrition worked, thanks to a small, damp notebook. It was carried by an anonymous infantryman, kept tucked inside his tunic to protect the fragile paper from the wet. It contains no heroic battlefield accounts. Instead, the pencil-written pages document mundane routines. They track shift times, drops in temperature, the sound of pickaxes striking frozen clay, and the exact speed at which water pooled in the bottom of the firebase. The ledger records a hidden friction. It shows how the official doctrine of a temporary front began to collide with a winter that felt permanent, and how the army's own routines were becoming as much of a burden as the cold itself. Command mandated a rigid daily cycle. Men stood to in the half-light of dawn, scraping heavy mud from their boots. Sentry shifts were enforced with absolute punctuality, forcing men to stand still even when the trench floor turned into a freezing channel of water. The manual required weapons to be kept in spotless condition. Soldiers spent hours trying to clean rifles in an environment made entirely of wet earth, fighting gunmetal that congealed in the cold, and handling metal magazines that burned bare skin. Strict hygiene and sanitation standards were heavily enforced. Medical orderlies lectured the men on delousing and keeping their feet dry. Yet inside the cramped dugouts, fuel was restricted, leaving no space and no heat to boil clothing or dry stiffened socks. This flowchart illustrates the mechanics of the failing trench. Standing water saturated leather boots within minutes. That wet equipment dropped body temperatures and reduced physical function. Numb, stiff men moved slower during work parties, which then increased their total time exposed to the freezing weather, starting the cycle over again. Strict adherence to the manual actively accelerated this collapse. The rigid schedule of ceremonial stand-tos and formal inspections drained the men's final physical reserves, burning vital calories simply to maintain the appearance of order for the chain of command. The troops quickly realized that official supply lines could not save them. The infrastructure was breaking down. Roads and communication trenches were deeply rutted and flooded, meaning hot rations and dry gear rarely reached the forward positions. To survive the freeze, the men created unapproved adaptations. The notebook details how they rotated the few dry socks among soldiers with the most damaged feet, hoarded private layers of newspaper, and stole straw from civilian farms for insulation, directly violating orders against looting. Every day required careful risk calculations. When the wind shifted, men would intentionally extinguish their only heating braziers, choosing freezing temperatures over producing smoke that might attract enemy snipers or draw the attention of their own officers. Basic survival relied entirely on this illicit economy. Staying alive required a continuous, quiet subversion of military regulations. In mid-January, the crisis peaked. Relentless rain drove the trench water up over the wooden duckboards. Boot leather saturated completely, and the section faced the immediate operational threat of a mass trench foot outbreak in the desperate state of the earthworks. Driven by necessity, the section made an unauthorized decision. They cut an illegal drainage slit into a low point of the trench wall. To make the drain hold, they cannibalized timber from a collapsed revetment, fully aware that dismantling existing defenses was a severely punishable offense. The illicit engineering worked perfectly. The water levels dropped, giving the men a rare, dry night of functional sleep. Then, a senior non-commissioned officer arrived to conduct a formal inspection of the trench line. He immediately spotted the missing timbers and the unauthorized cut. The section received a harsh reprimand for altering the trench. They were explicitly ordered to fill the life-saving drainage back in and restore the walls to exactly match the manual specifications. The men obeyed, and the water immediately pooled back over the duckboards. The military system placed a higher value on the visual uniformity of its engineering maps than on the physical, breathing survival of the soldiers trapped inside them. By March 1940, the winter thaw finally began, but the months of prolonged exposure had inflicted irreversible damage on the men's bodies. The casualty reports from this quiet front were not filled with shrapnel wounds. Men were pulled from the line because of severe frostbite, cracked heels, and systemic physical exhaustion. The strategic consequence was severe. When the active shooting war erupted months later, the British Army met the German offensive with a frontline force that was already depleted from simply holding wet ground. The infantryman's notebook never became a famous piece of literature. It survives as a vital historical record exactly because it is ordinary, repetitive, and entirely unheroic. It outlines a different kind of warfare. It proves that a combat unit can be effectively destroyed without a single artillery shell falling, dismantled slowly by friction, time, and routine. In a static war, the deadliest threat to a soldier is often the bureaucracy at their back, issuing impossible orders into the mud.